Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Way We Grow podcast, a production of the Craft Growers Network. I'm your host, Nick Wolfe. Today, we actually have two guests in the house. One is Chief Science Officer Dr. Tassa Saldi and Research Director Dr. Alfonso Garido-Lecca of TUMi Genomics. Tassa, Alfonso, how are you both doing today?
Oh, we're great.
Good. Thanks for having us on today.
Yes, thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited that you guys are both here today. Like we were saying before the podcast started, Tassa has done a lot of these podcasts for cannabis growers and cannabis-related content. So, and for our listeners as well, this is going to be a little bit of a different show because normally we interview growers, both like home grow and commercial growers, to gain an insight into their world. But we don't usually have two doctors in the house where you guys have an immense background in both genetics research and cannabis research specifically, and pathogen prevention and testing. So now I have been told, Alfonso, that you have also some experience with cannabis cultivation as a home grower and at a research level.
Yes.
So I would love for you to draw from that experience to kind of be the grower in the conversation. And Tassa, like I said before, you've been on numerous other podcasts. So we're going to kind of stay within that vein of thought here as well to best serve the listeners. But honestly, if we go off on a tangent, I'm super happy to let the flow of the conversation just carry us away, and I don't plan on stopping it. So I wanted to spend the first part of the show to gain a little background on both of you and how plants and science came together for you, whether it started off with one or the other, or if your involvement in both sort of developed in tandem. And then for the second part of the show, I want to talk about TUMi Genomics and how home growers and commercial cultivators should be aware of pathogens, how they can best mitigate them, and the steps to take if they detect a pathogen in their grow. So let's start with you, Tassa, because I feel like I've heard so much about how you operate through TUMi, but I don't really know about your background with plants. And maybe you have told this story before, but when did you first become interested in plants or science? Or was it something that they kind of came together in tandem, like I was saying?
So I guess plants have been a big part of my life for all of my life. I grew up out in the country in Colorado in a house with a big backyard, and my father's a master gardener. So I spent a lot of time in my childhood just following him around. And he taught me how to transplant plants and how to see when they're sick, how to see when they have like diseases and issues in the bark or whatever. And then, obviously he also had a huge collection of indoor plants. And so I just kind of grew up around plants. As you can see, that continues now.
Yeah.
And so gardening's always been something that I love. I love being outside. I love the smell of the dirt and growing things. My cat's going to video bomb us here in a second. Come here, cat.
Oh, that's fine. As you can see, we're lovers of cats here.
Yeah. We have a lot of pets, so we might get video bombed at any moment. But yeah, and so, I've always loved being outside. I loved growing things and living things. And I've also always loved science. I've just been interested in the way the world works, the way life works, how it works, why it works, pretty much my whole life. And I would say I got into biology and science in high school, taking all of those courses, and then I went straight into it in college, and it's just been something that's always fascinated me. And so once I discovered research, it was like I was home. To me, it's like there's all these questions that people don't know the answer to, and you just wonder. But for the first time in my life, you could answer a question that nobody knew the answer to. And then for a short period of time, you're the only person in the whole world that knows the answer to that question. And that is just so exciting.
Sure.
And it's like solving a big puzzle. And so for me, it was like exciting, and it was fun, and it was interesting. And oddly enough, I went into what is called RNA biology. And specifically, I studied the structure of RNAs. So that's like, it's like the three-dimensional shape that molecules take. And that particular shape carries information that tells the cell what to do with it. And I did my whole doctoral dissertation on that, and I also did my postdoc on that. And then when we moved into cannabis, and I'll let Alfonso tell the story because he has a lot. I think he started earlier with cannabis than I did. um, uh, we started looking into viroids, and viroids are three-dimensional RNAs that adopt a specific shape, and it's that shape that carries all of the information about how they're treated in the cell and how they become pathogenic. And so it just felt like, between the plants, which I have always loved, and discovering all of these pathogens, which are terrible but super fascinating to me. It just felt like the perfect combination of things to um, sort of make a career and make one that I really enjoy. So,
That's
um,
awesome.
yeah, yeah.
I I really like that it kind of coalesced together because sometimes I feel like, especially in the cannabis community that I participate heavily in, there's a lot of misinformation and people approaching this plant as something that's really magical and kind of like exceptional or special or different than other plants. But in so many ways, it's the exact same as any other crop plant in that it can harbor pathogens, viroids. The movement of these viroids and pathogens and pests are also kind of universally known, and they have been known for a long time. And so when we try to separate this plant from everything else that it's connected to within agriculture and horticulture, we start to lose sight of some of the more well understood methods of remedies that we can take for, um, a myriad of different problems that we might face as growers. Um, so, applying the science while you are also loving plants, it kind of opens up your eyes. I'm sure as you've experienced to where you can be like, well, no, I'll take this information, kind of Frankenstein it up a little bit because I can, use the information that I have for this other plant and just apply it right there and look, boom, it works.
Yeah.
So that it is really cool to be kind of on the cutting edge of something like that, where you're like discovering new things that you're like, oh my gosh, I can take this and apply it to something else. And um, that like feeling of discovery has got to be tremendous.
Yeah, no, it's been incredibly cool in cannabis because there's so much that's unknown. And you're right, there's a huge body of literature in agriculture that we can lean on. And, cannabis is an amazing plant, but it is a plant. And I would maybe argue that maybe all plants are kind of amazing in their own way, and there's probably a lot about them that we don't appreciate. But in cannabis, like you can read all of this literature, but there's a lot that's just not known. And so it's really exciting, to have a grower be like, well, I just seeded this mom plant that has hoplite and viroid. What do I do with those seeds? Are they going to have it too? And I'm like, I don't know. Let's do a research study. And so it's just really fun to be in that position where you can just be like, yeah, let's just set up a research study with a grower or, another lab and industry, and there's just so much to discover. And there's always an opportunity to discover more cool things. So it's a fun place to be in the sense there's so much unknown.
For
So,
sure.
yeah.
And just to get a little bit off topic because of something that you said there, when it comes to cannabis seeds, I believe I've heard either you say before or heard elsewhere that it's like 90 or 95% potential if it's the female plant has hop latent viroid that the seeds will become infected with hop latent viroid. And I might have my numbers off there, but I was curious, is this something that you're finding on the seed coating? Or is it something that you're finding within the germ plasm of like the seed?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the answer is both.
Wow.
The flower of for a cannabis flower for a plant that's infected with hoplite and viroid has an incredibly high level of viroid. I would say it's the tissue that accumulates the most viroid, and then second, of course, would be the root. So on the outside and even in that seed coat, the chances of finding the viroid, just taking that seed and throwing it in a tube, grinding it up and doing a PCR on it is very high. It's like 90, I mean, some of the plants, even 100% of those seeds will test positive. There is a difference, though. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you pop that seed, that the seedling will have hoplite and viroid. We've done studies together showing that the chances of the actual seedling having hoplite and viroid vary between 20 to 50%. And that depends a little bit on the cultivar and the level of infection of the mother. If the pollen carries it it's in our studies was much lower. It was like 5% of those seedlings.
Okay.
But if you say you have a packet of seeds that all came from the same mother and you want to know, did that mother have hoplite and viroid? Sending that seed in, one or two of those seeds, and doing a PCR. If the mother did have hoplite and viroid, you'd be able to tell just by a few seeds because the chances of finding like that are incredibly high.
Wow. Well, thank you for indulging me on my little tangent there because
Sure.
I just find that part really interesting as someone who likes to pop cannabis seeds.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. And just one last question on this first part for you, Tassa.
Sure.
When did you first encounter cannabis? Was it something that you encountered already as a research scientist, or did you have some experience with it prior?
Yeah, so this is a great segue into talking to Alfonso. So he's the director of research and development. He's also my husband. So I mostly encountered cannabis and growing of cannabis through Alfonso. He's been growing it for a very long time. And so we've been together for about 20 years. So, in the last 17 years or so, but that introduction happened when I met Alfonso.
All right, cool. Um, that's funny. My parents, it was the other way around. My mom introduced my dad to cannabis when he moved out from the Midwest to the West Coast. I feel like that's a story as old as time, though. So,
Yeah.
Alfonso, let's hear a little bit about when you first became interested in plants and or science, whichever came first, or if they came together in unison. Let's hear your plant story.
Yeah, so so I became interested in plants. I think I can remember. I was always into the outdoors, and plants. Just being around plants just make me happy. Just give me like a good feeling. And times that I was not feeling good, I could just sit around plants in the forest, and it would just like calm me down and make me go through the ideas. Uh, so in science, I was as a kid, I was had really ADHD to the extreme. So I wasn't I was not a good student in high school, so I thought that I will never become a scientist or anything like that. And interestingly, like when I tried cannabis for the first time when I was around 17, 18 years old, uh, it gave me a sense of I could just sit down and be able to read. Something that I have never experienced before. So that kind of opened the door to the academia and science, I guess, journey.
Sure.
And so then I guess I moved to the United States from Peru back in 1997. And when I was here and I decided to go into graduate school, I found that I could just smoke a little bit, and I was able to to read journal articles
Yeah.
and all this like literature. And so I started consuming cannabis in grad school very often, and I actually did my dissertation with cannabis because I wasn't able to sit down for like 8 months every single day and write 12 hours a day. It was kind of like intense.
Yeah.
But it was in that moment in which was always already growing in my basement since 2012, 2000 in Colorado. It became like you will be able to grow with your red card, with your medicinal card, which
Hmm.
I had. And I was growing in my basement, and the buds were incredible. They were like awesome, and everybody was like, "Oh yeah, you can grow cannabis," but in reality, it is just a plant. I could grow any plant from whatever, and so it was just a moment in time in which everything went to hell. Everything, like it was just like no more like resinous or sticky buds. They were all like a fluffy thing, and I was just like, okay, maybe the pH, the nutrients, the media, the tent, the water. I went through all these things like for like 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
And then after that time, we TUMi started, and we actually started in doing COVID. And then when we transitioned into cannabis, we designed the PCR test, and I said, well, we can use my plants as a negative control, and they should be negative because, right? And so then they were always positive, and they were like, "Oh, this test sucks, and we should like redesign it." And maybe it's hitting something in the cannabis plant. It's always positive. It doesn't matter. It doesn't. And then somebody gave me a plant, a little clone, and I used that one, and boom, it was negative. And I was like, I can't believe I was dealing with hoplate and viroid for the last 4 years. So
Wow.
2015 to 2020. So then that's how I realized, man, there will be a lot of people out there having the same problem as me, and I cannot even imagine if I only had 4 plants or 5 plants at the most. But if you have like an entire like facility full for acres of cannabis, then this is gonna really affect you.
Right.
So yeah, so that's I became aware of like this viroid could do to the plant and to the growers. So then I in it kind of like interesting parallel because at the same time when I was writing my dissertation, I was writing about an enzyme called RNA polymerase 2, which my dissertation was about like when the DNA has genes and this machinery needs to know where it starts and where it ends. And if like I think like 5% of the DNA is coded by genes and the other part is not. So we were interested in see how does the machinery knows when to stop. So I was writing about this, and hoplite and viroid, when it gets into the cell, it uses the same machinery to copy itself. So as I was dealing with hoplite and viroid in my own grow without me knowing, I was digging into this same machinery in the literature and knowing all these things about this enzyme. And it was just curious to see that I was dealing with this in my grow, and I was probably at that moment I knew the entire literature of that enzyme, which goes back 40 or 50 years of research.
Wow. So you were able to kind of apply all of that previous research to the current problem, which was the hopslate and viroid that you were
Correct.
facing.
Yes, correct. And but also at the same time, there was is very little known about it. It is because the cell uses the machinery to do something similar but not the same. The viroid is exploiting that to on its own benefit, but it's not like what is intended to do. But that
Mm.
actually works in the favor of the viroid because it makes a lot of mistakes when it's copying itself. But that's what the viroid wants because it wants to evolve and mutate and try to adapt to the different strains. So that's why maybe people say, and I experience it myself, that when a plant is infected with hoplite and viroid, it's strain dependent on what you're going to see. And it may be that that's due to the differences in mutations in the viroid, which I think are
Okay.
called quasi
Quasi-species.
quasi species or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's really fascinating because, I've seen a bunch of people deal with hoplite and viroid and it just completely wreck their grow. But then I've also seen people who just not outclone it, but they'll keep, vibrant new mothers for their production and replace them at a regular interval where they're not building up a a threshold that then creates these devastating effects.
Yeah.
And I've even heard of people using things like putting aspirin in their nutrient feed because the acetaminophen will affect the rate at which um, the viroid builds up in the tissue. I believe that that's the how that occurs. If you guys know anything more about that specifically, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so first the strain dependency. So it's really interesting. We have actually done a study in collaboration with State House in California where we took 12 different strains. We cut clones from them from mothers that were confirmed negative for hoplite and viroid, and we infected them as clones. And then we grew them throughout their lifetime, and we tested them every couple of weeks and sort of followed the viroid infection in all these different 12 strains. And it was really fascinating because we found some that were incredibly sensitive. Like they were super stunted, super messed up. We'd lost a ton of yield. And with those particular strains, I think you'd be unlikely to be able to outclone it or outgrow it, or even if you took really, really good care of those strains, they're just so sensitive that they just kind of like crapped out. There were others that seemed resistant, like it was really difficult to get all of the plants infected. The viroid load grew incredibly slowly, and even though they were all positive at the end of the study, most of them, we didn't see a huge drop in yield or THC levels or anything like that. And then there was one strain, which I thought was kind of terrifying, that was super easy to infect. It like skyrocketed viroid level instantly and grew all the way to adulthood with zero impact at all. It was like
Wow.
just tolerant, which is great for that strain, but it kind of functions somewhat like a Trojan horse if you have that thing in your facility, because
Sure.
you're like, oh, this thing looks great. I'm just going to clone it and I'm just not going to worry about it. And you're like silently spreading it to all of your other strains. So it's scary. It's super strain dependent, and there are certain strains where I do think that it would be possible to clone so frequently because the viroid it either is traveling very slowly or it's replicating slowly, so that you're never going to see a major impact. It does continue to be an infection risk for the rest of your plants. So if you are doing that, it's important to be aware that you're cloning plants that are positive so that you can be incredibly careful about touching your other plants. As far as adding aspirin, I think that they're probably the ideas there is the salicylic acid, which is a plant hormone that can sort of elicit the immune system for the plant. And so adding that there is evidence in the literature that it can slow viroid replication or the accumulation of viroid in some crops. The evidence isn't like, outstanding. It's like 8% or something, but it can help. Although I'm still a proponent of just getting nice, clean moms and testing to make sure that you don't have it, and just like preventing it in the beginning instead of trying to treat it after the fact, because that's
Sure.
incredibly hard.
Yeah. Um, well, if we could go over maybe a few symptoms that growers might find where they might want to then be on the alert or potentially start to look into getting the plants tested for hoplite and viroid. And if we could go over kind of what you might see in a vegetative stage of growth, as
Sure.
well as what you would see in a flowering stage of growth.
Yeah. So, and I guess if you have any symptoms to add, just throw them in there. Yeah. So symptoms are incredibly variable. If you see symptoms, some of the more common ones with hoplite and viroid are going to be the plant will get stunted. It has kind of irregular growth. So normally like the branches are going to come off at like a 45-degree angle, but with hoplite and viroid, they tend to come off horizontally, which makes them very brittle. So if you have a plant and you like go like this and all the branches break on the way down, that's really characteristic of hoplite and viroid. You can also see leaf discoloration, chlorosis, abnormal leaf shape. It does affect the growth of the root system. So
the leaf size.
yes, the leaves can be small, yellow. Sometimes they
They're not like the big fan leaves. They're like little, smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
And then the root system also can be affected. So if you have clones and they're just rooting incredibly slowly and you don't have like any sort of environmental reason to suspect that they dried out or something, sometimes that could be a sign that the mom plant had hoplite and viroid.
What sort of time frames are you seeing on the cloning process and that extension that you're mentioning?
Yeah, I don't, do you have a feel for the time frames?
Like when you see the
Like
pair.
it takes longer to root the sick ones.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It's like a very strain dependent, I guess. But I will say, like what I have seen, like what happened to me is like when the clone is infected with HLVD, and because I'm growing them, the infected ones and the non-infected ones, and if one day I forget to water them because I was away, or like usually all the leaves kind of like drop and kind of like the plant feels sad, but you add water and it kind of like recuperates. But I seen that for the hoplite and viroid ones, they can't deal with it. They just, the majority of them, they just die, and the
Okay.
leaves become dried up and crispy, and yeah, I don't know if
Yeah, I mean it's about a 2x decrease in root mass, so it
Okay.
takes about twice as long for it to get to that same place as a healthy one. And sometimes they don't make it at all. Like you just don't see those really nice white roots. And it just depends a little bit on how sick the mom was too.
For
Um,
sure.
yeah.
yeah, but this, for the bottom line, is like it's very hard to figure it out just by eye. Probably if you are you've seen it a lot, and probably your eye is already uh, used to it to identify it. But for that reason, I think it's good to test, and you don't have to test like a lot. You have to test smart, like at a specific point. Like you have to test, for example, the mother before cutting the clones, and then you have to test the clones. You test, like it is kind of like building protocols and SOPs so that you can test in a smart way, and you don't have to spend that much money on it, but you protect yourself.
For sure. Yeah, I heard test early and test often. And then, if you have a pretty, good assurance that you don't have it, then just don't bring any genetics in that you don't know where they're coming from.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and also another thing is like if you like sometimes me, I want to smoke some cheap weed. You find at the dispensary, you don't have much money, and you just like usually those cheap weed that look like little buds and stuff, maybe full of hoplite and viroid. And so you come and roll a joint and then go and clean your garden. You may pass it that way. So it is important to, I think, like use gloves, especially if you're a stoner, and and protect your clothes. Uh, it
Right.
is very easy to pass it.
How late have you tested dried flower? Like how long after it has been dried has hops latent viroid been detectable and transmittable?
So, so we actually haven't done those studies, but Zamir Punja from Simon Fraser University in Canada did a big study where he took flower from dispensaries all over the place, and I'm gonna space the percentage, but it was like 70 to 80% of the flower he found over there was infected.
Wow.
So it's incredibly common. And like I said, it's in a very, very high level in the flower. So even if the plant got that infection later on and then it didn't impact the flower because it wasn't infected for very long, the flower itself is still going to have a lot of viroid in it. Viroids in general can stay active for about 3 months in dried tissue. It usually requires like kind of rehydration, and then it can become infectious. Some studies say up to 6 months, so it kind of depends on which viroid you're looking at. Although those studies, like you were saying, there's a lot of literature in other plants. They were not done in cannabis with hop latent viroid. So that's a guideline. In general, if you're getting weed, grinded up weed all over you, just be real careful before you go in there and cuddle with your plants because it's super easy to transmit it, and then you're going to be stuck with
Yes.
years of frustration
Oh
or
yeah,
just
no.
your plants. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a good point because I don't feel like a lot of people would think about that. But it does make sense if you are already seeing detection on the outside of seed shells. Um, I mean, that's basically the same as the dried flower at that point in terms of what environment those viroids are facing outside of the living tissue. Um, yeah, that's very, very fascinating. All right, and then with the flower morphology and the other symptoms you might face or find in flowering cannabis plants, what are some of those?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, hop latent viroid's biggest impact is going to be on the flower. It basically the flowers that come out of infected plants, especially the susceptible ones, are you're going to lose a lot of density. They'll be more like the fluff. The cannabinoid content, both THC and CBD, go way down. You don't see the same type of trichome formation, and they just don't produce as much terpenes and all of that. And so they're basically, like the disease. The nickname is they're duds. Uh, Pretty much, it just tanks the flower completely.
Wow. And then like are there any cases that you've seen where the symptoms only present in part of the flowering plant, or perhaps like one branch, but everything else is kind of looking as you would expect it to look?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the important things to realize about viroids is they're like molecules. They're not like living things that have the ability to move about the plant on their own. So when a plant gets infected, like say you cut a branch and you cut it with a dirty tool and the viroid gains access, it has to move about the plant with the photoassimilates, which is basically the goo inside the plant that's transferring the energy of the sun or the lights to areas of the plant that can't make their own energy. So the viroid is going to move from what's called a source to a sink. And so sink areas are areas that can't make their own energy. So it's going to go to, new growth that doesn't have the capability to do photosynthesis yet, or it'll go into the roots. Obviously, there is no photosynthesis going on there, which is why testing the roots is so useful because it has to go down there because it needs the energy from the foliage. But the bottom line is it's not going to go to every branch, at least not right away. And sometimes there can be a huge delay, like 2 months or whatever, like the lifetime of the plant. And so what ends up happening is you can see exactly what you described. Some branches are going to look super, infected and sick, and the buds are going to be terrible. And then other branches are going to look just fine because the viroid either hasn't traveled there or hasn't been there long enough to build up enough of a load to really impact the plant.
For sure. And then in terms of see, I lost my train of thought there. So with like the flowering cycles then, and you seeing it only in one branch, potentially, or across an entire, canopy if the viral level is that high in the mother plant, other than a decrease in flower quality, maybe could you describe some of what you might have seen in some of the plants that were more resistant, but still with a reasonably high level of viroid presence within the tissue?
Yeah, so that's the sort of trick that hoplate and viroid plays on all of us. If the plants are somewhat resistant or tolerant, you often don't see much of anything. And so you can look across the canopy and be like, everything looks great. I don't need to test it, whatever, but it can look very asymptomatic. So it's important to know what the symptoms are, to know that something might be percolating in there that you need to test for, but it's also important to realize that it can exist asymptomatically. And it's still important to confirm, especially if you're bringing in new things, that it's not sick before you put it next to all your important mother plants. The other really important observation we made is that if plants test negative or have an incredibly low viroid load at the kind of at the end of propagation, like the 2 to 3 week um, time point, even if they end up building a pretty high load by the time they flower out, we don't tend to see symptoms. So, for example, you could have a plant that accumulates viroid very slowly, and let's say you're vegging, you keep some for veg or to replace your moms, and it builds up that load slowly. You may not see it in the first couple of generations, and then maybe in the second or third generation, all of a sudden the clones have enough of a load that when they go into flower, it's affected the biology enough that now you're going to see it. And so, in a sense, it can kind of sneak up on you as
Sure.
well. So, really, if you just keep a few moms that are clean and you test them, consistently, and you can cut off those moms and then they can be propagation mothers. You don't have to like have thousands, but that's the best way to protect yourself, because you can't rely on the symptoms, because you just might not see it right away.
Sure. And along the same sort of line with the symptoms that you might um, associate with hoplite and viroid, are there any other pathogens or viroids that can cause similar symptoms that may be less pervasive, but might be almost like a false positive if you're just trying to visually identify what's going on in your garden?
Yes. So it's important to recognize that symptoms like leaf discoloration and stunting are incredibly generic. And there's a plethora of viral or pathogens that can cause things like that. And so just seeing those symptoms, it's something that hoplite and viroid should be occur to you, but it's not necessarily a given that that's what your plant has. The viroidum, sorry, the collection of viroids and viruses
Keto.
that impact cannabis is kind of under studied right now, so we don't know a lot about it. There are a few like alfalfa mosaic virus, tobacco streak virus. Um, what else would cause those symptoms? There's beet curly top virus. These have all been characterized in cannabis. Most of them are going to be more of a concern if you're growing outside. But it's all possible that it could be caused by those types of things instead. Did you want to add something?
Lettuce
Oh,
sclerosis.
yes, lettuce sclerosis. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, because I feel like sometimes, there's a little bit of a dog whistle when you hear uh, HLVD, people start to freak out and they just think, oh my God, every little symptom that I notice in my garden where my plants don't look healthy, that's got to be it, man. And the world is coming to an end right now. And so I've even heard of kind of stories where people have chucked out their entire genetic collection because they were worried about one plant and then they realized they had been using the same scissors or scalpel for the past year and they're like, well, of course I have it. I don't even want to spend the money to get it tested because the same money that you could spend on the tests in some cases you could just spend to get the genetics back from a clean source. And even nowadays, you can get them as generation zero clones from tissue culture labs that are going to provide you a much more secure way of acquiring genetics if they have all of the paperwork and documents to match.
Yeah, yeah. But the tissue culture is important to know that it's not 100%.
Right.
That it is a very, you can imagine just like what they're trying to isolate is a bunch of little cells, the meristems, but the adjacent cells that are not the stem cells are right there. So if you're with a scalpel, it doesn't matter how many times you've done it. If you just cut it a little bit on the wrong part, everything will be contaminated. So the tissue culture, even if you go through tissue culture, those people that are doing tissue culture should check that if the viroid has been eradicated. I also have heard, although I have never done it, but I have heard from people, breeders, that they have been able to outgrow the viroid by just cutting the shoot, the apical shoot, and they say that they have to cut it 3, 4, 5 times. That sometimes is like a very lengthy, more than a year process. So they were saying like it's not worth it. But you can imagine if that shoot grows, because it grows pretty fast, and you haven't had the chance for the viroid to get there, and you cut it, you have a chance to I'll compete the viroid, I guess.
For sure. I've heard the exact same stories and from a bunch of different people, and I feel like that does give a lot of hope for what was called, like 2 or 3 years ago, the potential uh, supervillain of the cannabis industry, because people were losing entire rooms worth of yields out of their facilities over the course of a given space of time, and um, I could see, especially with kind of the downturn that the cannabis market has been facing lately in terms of the price per pound and the overhead cost and the operational cost,
Right.
that like all of them are going in the wrong direction for there to be a decent profit margin. And if something like this, where you could say, look, I have this population of plants, and if they have hop latent viroid, I can face, a 50% yield, let's just say, loss, and that alone would be devastating. It might not even be tenable at that point. So that's why I'm really excited to get this information out to people, because I do feel as though um, where there is a lot of potential for yield loss and crop failure even, there is also a lot of hope for how you might be able to prevent it, combat it, as well as ameliorate those issues overall. Um, well, I think we've gotten a little bit of a good background now on both of your guys, and I think I want to kind of move into a little bit more about TUMi Genomics and what you guys do there. So, if you could both go over a little bit about your roles at the company and maybe any exciting projects that you're working on currently.
Um, you want to start?
Uh, yeah. So, I mean, I guess just a quick background on TUMi Genomics. We are a pathogen testing company, as well as a company that provides guidance and recommendations for growers. So if you do have an issue, we don't just give you a test result and be like, good luck. Um, we do a lot of consulting and building pathogen mitigation programs for growers. And kind of as a side, when we founded TUMi Genomics, or we founded, the company in general, we founded it with the concept that we wanted to bring, basically kick-ass science or great science to industries or geographies that are underserved. And I think the cannabis industry, when we discovered it, it was exactly what our company was founded to do. And so our main focus at TUMi Genomics is providing, not just that testing and the pathogen mitigation and all of that, but also the information and the research that people can rely on. It's done correctly, it's done with the right controls, so that we can sort of start chipping away at some of the misinformation and the unanswered questions so growers have what they need to be successful. And I think you had brought up, like people are like, oh, I'm screwed. My whole life is over. I'm just going to throw everything away. And I think that there's a lot of fear around pathogens in cannabis in general, and especially around hoplate and viroid. And one of the most important things for me is for people to understand that um, with information, you can combat fear. There's no reason to feel like you have to be terrified of this thing or it's going to ruin your whole life or the world is ending. There's a lot you can do to protect your facility or your grow. And there's even a way we've helped people who have like rampant infections kind of build up a clean stock or, a sort of a genetic bank of very healthy mothers, and then slowly over time work through moving the viroid out of the facility without having to shut operations down and lose a ton of money. Because it's not, whether you're a home grower or you have a huge facility, you don't always want to be like, and now I'm just going to cut it off and have nothing, no flower at all. And so that's the whole basis of this company, is really to fight fear and to bring information to growers so that they are empowered to do something about this. And so with that, the way we do that is through research with academic industries, as well as with industry like cultivation partners and things, to sort of answer some of those questions. We do testing. We test plant tissue for, the main three that are going to ruin your life are hoplite and viroid, fusarium, and pythium. The fusarium and pythium are mold or mold-like infections that can tank your plants or your entire facility. And then we also test for a myriad of other viruses and pathogens that are much less common, but if the symptoms warrant it, that we can also test for all of those things as well. As well as providing pathogen mitigation programs. So if you realize your facility has 30% infection, what do I do? We'll get on the phone with you. We'll learn a lot about your facility and your practices, and then we'll identify ways that you can correct the issue, like a testing plan that's within your budget so that you can start to work through it, and, kind of correcting some of the cultural practices around sterility and, people movement and all of those things to sort of make sure that that it's cleared out. Also, if you have a pathogen like a fungal infection, we help people track those down so we can test your water, your air, your growing media, kind of figure out where it's coming from, why it's happening to you, and then build you a plan around that to sort of get yourself out of it. We'd like to think that we're a complete scientific solution, that we're partners with growers and we help them work through these issues and come out the other side clean and successful.
That's awesome. I feel like that's super important. Because sometimes just giving, it's kind of the difference between like leading the horse to water, right? Like you can lead them there, and then if you just leave them there, they may or may not drink. But if you kind of show them that you can drink the water, right, and then how you get through all of these problems, potentially if it's a pathogen or a viroid that you're facing, that's such a huge benefit to add to the services that you guys are providing, because it is really hard to figure out then what you do,
Yeah.
especially if you're already dealing with flower rooms and environmental parameters and irrigation maintenance, and oh, you got a drying room that you need to have trimmed and all this other stuff that like the life of a grower is very hectic and can be very time consuming. And so to add then the extra stress on top of it of something like a pathogen or a viroid, it's almost like dealing with a pest infestation
Yeah.
where you have this huge battle in front of you that you see and you go, I just gotta kind of toughen up and buckle down and get to it. And I feel like sometimes maybe the fear of these different pathogens and viroids is because you don't really see the damage until it's too late.
Mhm.
And the the path to fixing it is not as easy as applying a pest spray, where pests are already such a big problem that it's like the next level of hell is viroids,
Yeah.
because you have so much, so much is unknown to the grower in the moment. And yeah, it's great that you guys do provide sort of the whole holistic package for growers. Uh, that's awesome. Alfonso, though, let's hear a little bit more about your role with the company
Yes.
and any potentially exciting projects, considering you are the director of research.
Yes. So I have developed all the test services that we offered, but in particular, we are aware that the PCR technology is kind of like a 20th century technology. It has been around for 50 so years. So we are trying to move away from that into a more 21st century science technological tests. So we developed the TUMi Globe for growers to test in their facility for hoplate and viroid, and and that's important because it costs the costs a lot, because a PCR machine is 50K, and the reagents are expensive. It's time consuming, preparing. And so we were trying to basically develop something that will overcome all those things. So we did our Tumi Glow, and now I am working on basically making the fusarium equivalent of the Tumi Glow, so that growers in the grow can test for HOVD and for fusarium. And probably I haven't started it yet, but probably in the next year we will be doing the same for Pythium and other common diseases that you will find. At the
Awesome.
same time, there's this technology called next generation sequencing, in which we are trying to get into it, because it's becoming with the years super cheap to just, instead of you asking me, does my plant has hoplite and viroid, you can ask, what does my plant has? And then the NGS, or next generation sequencing, will be able to tell you all the pathogens that your plant may have in that moment.
Wow.
And the costs are like super low compared to PCR.
Is it something to do with like having it has like a bank of references that it can use versus having like a direct reference of like having the confirmed positive, and then you take that and compare it to
Yeah,
the
like
information?
yeah, basically what you do is just sequence the entire nucleic acids, DNA or RNA of the. So you will get by default a bunch of the plant stuff, but then you can focus on the pathogens, non-plant sequences. And online, free, there's libraries, databases of all these pathogens and their sequences. So you basically, with a computer, bioinformatically, you can see, okay, this sequence, which is repeated 100,000 times in my sample, what is it? And then you go to this database and it tells you, okay, this sequence is this pathogen,
That's
Fusarium.
awesome.
Yeah. So it's like a better approach than the old PCR technology.
And I'm sure you could even then kind of apply some of these different AI learning models and kind of sift through that information even faster and more accurately.
Yes. This technology is going advancing at a very high pace. Like
That's awesome. Uh, you know, it, that's also just another level of hope for the growers, where it's going to allow for such a more comprehensive testing um, scenario for them, where they're going to be able to just find out that much more about their plants and what they can then do to help improve their grows overall, or their yields, their health of the plants. all those different things. That's great because I bet you there's probably a lot of other sort of combinations of pathogens or just little issues that would be something as simple as applying like a oxyphos or a xerotol or something like that to the
Sure.
plant and be able to kind of kill it off, take a new cutting, outgrow it, outstrip it, and be free of that potential issue. So that's really great. Um, so, I like to do this podcast for both home growers and commercial cultivators because I feel like there's a lot of information that can help both of them, but at different ways in a lot of times. And so, for the services that you guys provide, both for home growers and commercial growers, when should people potentially look into getting testing done for their plants? Like what I know we kind of went over some of the signs and symptoms, but if you were to go to say a new grower and they've heard of hoplate and viroid, right? They know that they can get tested, but they go, well, I'm just growing a plant. I don't know if I should get it tested or not. Or as a commercial grower, right? They're not seeing yield loss or anything significant. Like what are some of those things that they should be aware of where they go, I need to start looking into testing?
So I guess my take on it is that prevention is always going to be significantly cheaper, faster, and easier than trying to mitigate it once it's spread in your facility. And often you don't see anything, like you were saying, until it's gotten really bad. And then fixing it becomes this thing that feels very overwhelming and requires a lot of intervention. So if I were starting a brand new grow and I was bringing in new clones, the first thing I would do is go to my clone provider and say, hey, did you test these clones? Or did you test the mother that you cut these clones from? For ideally hoplite and viroid and fusarium, because you don't want either of those in your facility. Pythium can be not quite as bad, but obviously you don't want to be bringing that in either. So confirming, if you can, that the clones you're purchasing are negative is step one. If you already have mothers growing in your facility, I would definitely do kind of a baseline test. Ideally, the way people are organizing their mothers is that they have it kind of depends on the size of your facility and how many production mothers you need, but you have a smaller subset of plants that are called nuclear stock. So let's say, if you need 20 mothers of each strain, you have a few moms that are uh, represent that strain, but they're kept in a separate place, even if it's a separate table in the corner. And, even if you're a home grower and you have stuff going on in your basement, you have a little tent with, one or two of each strain that you like to grow that are protected, that you keep the bugs away. You're very careful when you're handling them. Those should be tested periodically. Ideally, you test them before you cut clones off of them, and you test the clone that will become the replacement mother. So, depending on the cadence of how often you're replacing those. And that's to make sure that nothing sneaks in and sort of, is sneakily moving about your basement or your huge facility until it, basically kicks you in the ass 6 months later and you're looking at this huge loss. So I guess the short answer, that was a really long answer. The short answer is, I don't think there's a time when you should say, and now I start testing. It's a continual thing that you do. And it doesn't need to be thousands and thousands of dollars, but it does need to be something that's worked into your regular process. Because if you skip that and you work without information, it's kind of like a ticking time bomb. You don't know when things are going to go south for you. So it's better to just prevent it at the offset.
For
So you
sure.
I was just gonna say that in my case, since you were talking about Nick about how you sprout seeds, I have found that before sprouting them, like sticking them into 10 to 20% bleach for 1 minute, it thus
It's important.
is important because if the HOVD is in the outside of the coat, it will destroy it. Or if in any fungi, anything fungal-like is in the outside, it will also destroy it. So it is it will just take you 1 minute. I have not seen any decrease in germination rate. The seeds are pretty tough, and so yeah, so that's a good practice to do before you sprouting your seeds.
For sure. And is the other product that you can use, is it called zircon, or is it
Oh,
It's Vircon.
very
Vircon.
Vircon?
Yeah.
Thank you. Zircon, I think, is an allergy medicine.
Yeah.
Uh,
That does sound familiar to me.
I don't know why my mind went there, but V and Z, they're
yeah,
at the
yeah.
end of the
Very
alphabet.
same side of the alphabet. Yeah.
Okay, so Vircon is the other product that people can use.
Mhm.
Also potentially for seed washes ahead of times, just to give yourself that extra assurance. And when you're using the bleach on the seed wash, do you recommend letting that bleach fully dry on the seed coating after removing it from the solution, or do you rinse it with water?
I
Um,
rinse it with water.
okay, great. That's good to know. I know that sometimes, like with different chemical applications, you need to allow it to like either fully dry in the air so it
Yeah,
has the full effect.
I rinse it with water, but I have many times forgotten, like stone, and you're like, oh wow, I forgot, and but they still do great.
Cool. Well, that's great to hear. I feel like some people think that bleach is the complete enemy of a grow, but in a lot of ways, it's probably one of your best friends to make sure that
Yeah,
things stay
I mean,
clean. And
yeah, it's the enemy of your clothes.
yeah,
The clothes, yeah.
yes,
Fashion
yes.
enemy for sure. Yeah.
Yes, and even with things like hypochlorous acid, it still has the chlorine molecule in it, so that it'll test for on chlorine strips at the same, in the same way that bleach would, but bleach just is that hypochlorite rather than
Correct.
hypochlorous,
Yep.
which it seems to be as though the hypochlorous acid has a little bit more of a gentler effect on biologicals, but still makes the surroundings sterile.
Yeah, yeah. And so unfortunately, like sterile generally means that you're killing, it's usually fungus and bacteria, right? And that's actually a lot of the pathogens that you're gonna need to worry about, especially the fungus. Viroids are weird. They don't have an outside coat. They don't have any lipids or fats or proteins associated. It's just genetic information. And so the stuff that will work to decontaminate viroids is the list is very tiny. There's bleach, obviously, which thankfully is super easy to find everywhere
And cheap.
and cheap. Yeah.
Hmm.
And you're diluting it 1 to 10, so it's 1 part bleach, 9 parts water. So you're going to use it pretty slowly. Or that Vircon 2%. Although I do like to tell people it's only one study that was shown to be effective. That doesn't mean it's
Okay.
effective in all viroids, but the doesn't have nearly as much data as bleach does. Bleach has it's basically the positive control in all studies. Like if somebody wants to try something new, they're like, well, bleach should work for sure. Does it work as well as bleach? And so it it's important to remember that one is the most effective for decontaminating stuff.
For sure. I always suggest a 10% bleach solution for anybody. Um, that it's cheap, it's accessible. I always tell people to make sure that they're soaking their cutting scissors in a 10% bleach solution and making sure that they sit there for a minute. If you're not like agitating them, vigorously. And I believe that I've learned that from you through the We the Growers podcast. It was very informative information that you gave people there. Um, and would you mind touching briefly on why people shouldn't use alcohol to try to help prevent the spread of viroids?
Yes, absolutely. So alcohol's mechanism of action is going to be to dehydrate proteins. And so people use like isopropyl alcohol and stuff, like it's hand sanitizer. And that works fine for viruses and bacteria. Although I'll be honest, it's not amazing, but it does work. The problem with viroids is because they are just naked genetic information, nothing in the mechanism of action of alcohol works at all. And actually, alcohol stabilizes genetic information. And so using alcohol actually will stabilize viroids and make it easier to infect the next plant. So there was one study where I think this was using potato spindle tuber viroid, but it has the same structure as hoplate and viroid. And they basically took the infected scissors and dipped it in water and then cut the next plant, and the transmission rate was like 70%. But if they dipped it in alcohol, it went up to 90 to 95% transmission.
Wow.
So you're pedaling backwards by using alcohol. So just don't use that. It doesn't work at all on viroids. It just makes it worse.
Or the
For sure.
flame torch, which
Yes, and a flame doesn't even work on viroids. They've done that experiment as well. So
is amazing.
they're
That is crazy.
tough little buggers, viroids. It's
Is
wild. They're very stable.
is there a heat threshold for destruction of a viroid, or can they withstand basically any heat that we would be able to apply to them?
So there is a heat threshold. I believe it was 140 degrees Celsius.
Woo.
That's really hot. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but and it was like a
Almost
10-minute.
300 degrees.
Yeah. But they did do, for example, a propane blowtorch that did not cut it. So they're very heat stable. So I would, bleach is so easy. It's so accessible. It's so cheap, and it works like that. So I just recommend that to people because I don't have investment in a bleach company, but it works. There's just so much data. I'm like, this just works. So.
For sure. Well, that's great information for people because I feel like a lot of people will just be like, I have alcohol for my scissors because I use it to clean off all the gunk when I'm trimming my weed, and so I'm just going to use that to spray everything down. It smells like alcohol. How can it not be clean?
Right?
Um, but it's very important to know that it will help even spread the pathogen further. And I believe I've even heard before that it's used in like in vitro reproduction of viroids. Like you can use alcohol to kind of help proliferate their spread um, within the alcohol, or maybe it was just that it would spread easier if then applied to a plant. Uh,
Yeah, so I mean, alcohol is used frequently in the lab to help precipitate. So you can take like genetic information can actually become like a solid, and you can precipitate it into like a little like particulates at the bottom of the tube. And alcohol helps with that process. And it makes them very stable. So if you store them in alcohol in the freezer, they last much longer than if you store them
oh,
in water. And so that's why it helps to transmit it because it makes them more stable and it kind of helps them precipitate into these little
Constant.
particulates. Yeah, it concentrates it. So yeah, it's a no-go for viroids.
but they don't replicate in the alcohol.
No, 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 no. They
Okay,
require, like Alfonso was saying, they require that machine that exists inside the cell.
right.
And so they actually have to be in a living cell in order to replicate.
Got it. Okay, that all great information. Um, so, I mean, we've talked about bleach, we've talked about the Vircon, um, and those are just kind of the chemical ways of destroying or potentially destroying the viroid. Are there any other practices that home growers might use to help prevent pathogens or help prevent the spread? And then also in that same line of thought, what are some of the treatments that people can use?
Yeah, so I mean, I would recommend starting from the beginning. If you bring something new into your facility or into your basement, you need to have a quarantine area. So that can just be the corner, like underneath a lamp with a bench or a little tent or something. And make sure that you put that plant there and it has a separate set of tools. You use gloves when you're messing with it. and test that plant. Test it at the minimum for hoplate and viroid, and I would test it for fusarium as well. If you want, you can test for pythium also. Those three are going to give you misery if you find them. Do not put them next, like in the tent with your favorite strains until you make sure that that plant isn't infected. Generally, I would recommend 2 tests about 2 to 3 weeks apart, just in case the viroid was at a very low level in the beginning. And this is just really important when you're bringing in new genetics into a place where you know it's clean. While you're waiting, obviously you want to be looking for bugs, any kind of weird discoloration, any other funky symptoms that you're like, oh, okay, I don't really want my plants to have that. And so just be scouting those new clones. Once you put it into, the tent or the mom room or whatever, you want to be just very careful, especially with your mother plants. It's always good to wear gloves. You can, like Alfonso was saying, you can have viroid on your hands if you're smoking or grinding. You can also have like fungus, bacteria, and you just don't want to be touching your plants with your naked hands. If you like to garden outside, which I do, and it's awesome, but like things like fusarium, pythium, and other kinds of molds, like, botrytis and all sorts of nasty stuff is outside. So if you're coming into your grow in your basement or into your facility, you need to be aware that it could be on your gardening clothes, it can be on the bottom of your shoes. So just throw on, like if you just get a lab coat or even, change your shoes out like Mr. Rogers before you go down there, something like that. So you're not bringing stuff in to your facility or into your basement. And then as you're working with your plants, when you have your gloves on and you're moving from plant to plant, if you make a 10% bleach solution and put it in a little spray bottle, then, you can be like trimming or whatever with a plant. You're going to put your scissors in the 10% bleach, just spray some on your hands and rub it around. And then you shake it like that. It's okay to touch the plants with the 10% bleach. That concentration isn't going to hurt them. And that's to just sort of clean them. So you're not the big vector there, transferring it from plant to plant. It's important to remember the roots have a very high level. So ideally, your plants, especially if there's water at the bottom of your tent or they're on a table and there's runoff, they're elevated a little bit. So the roots aren't sitting in that runoff water because you can transfer it through the water. And same goes for fungal pathogens. And remember things like clonal trays, or if you want to do a flood and drain or something like that, that's another big transmission risk for hoplate and viroid. And then obviously insects, there's just information coming out right now from CSU showing that I believe it was aphids they found, but kind of any insect that's going to chew up and get on the sap, like on their mouth parts or whatever, and then they go to another plant, you could transfer it like that as well.
Or pets.
Yes, we're
Pets.
like
Cats. My cats like to chew on the leaves, and there's not any data out there, but I can just see if my cat is chewing on the leaf and then it's gonna chew on the other one.
It would make sense.
Right? And then another thing that I've seen that happens, although there's no data to it, but one time we had like a plant which was negative and a plant that was positive right next to each other, and we were using it to test just as our controls for the lab. And we noticed that one day they got fungus gnats, and all of a sudden the negative plant was positive.
Sure.
So the fungus gnats has this stage in which when they're before flying, they live in the soil and they feed on the roots. So that's, I think, like a way for the viroid to get wings and just fly to the other side.
Sure. I've heard it be transmitted with root aphids as well.
Sure.
Yeah, anything like that, I mean, unless they're producing some sort of chemical in their body that's going to destroy the viroid. But as we've previously discussed, there's not a lot of those chemicals that we can even use in a lab setting. And so it's doubtful that the bugs are producing chlorine in their bodies. So yeah, I've heard that before, that pathogen pressures can definitely increase with pest pressures because of the transmittability through the the pests being the vector. Um, let's see, are there any other vectors that you feel like growers should be aware of that we may not have touched on yet?
Let's see, mechanical is going to be the most common way. Seed, it's possible. So you should definitely be testing seed. And like I said, one seed from a seed packet, if all those seeds came from the same mother, is sufficient really to determine whether or not they're infected. Insects are definitely a possibility. Water transmission is real, and there's plenty of data to support that now. So you need to be thinking about that. Roots touch each other. Like if you have things super, super close together and the roots are like kissing, that's a possibility too. It's not the same with the foliage. If the foliage is really close, as long as there's no breakage, where there's like sap transfer between two like wounds or micro wounds, you're okay there. And Alfonso was saying, other things you don't think about, like your pets, your cats, and anything you bring in from the outside. Remember that weeds are vectors too for a lot of
For
these
sure.
things.
I
What
have a
about
quick
pollen?
Yes, and it is in the pollen as well.
Okay.
So be careful with that too.
I do have a question about the foliage. Is there any potential for it to be released through the moisture that as the stomata are sort of transpiring? Because I know that, sometimes you get the leaves that will overlap, let's say from two plants that are next to each other, and when you pull them apart, it'll be a nice wet layer on both the top and the bottom of the leaf that we're touching. Now, that's not necessarily a wound, but it could be considered like a transfer of fluids. Um, is there any potential there for the viroid to transfer?
Yeah, so there's no evidence that it can transfer, like, with respiration byproducts or whatever for plants. It's mostly going to be contained, within the cells of the plant and in the sap, which is kind of how
Okay,
it travels around. But if there's little cuts on both of those leaves, and we're not talking about like, half the leaf is missing, it can be really like microscopic. That's sufficient to transfer it between those two leaves.
great information. Yeah, it's just prepping people for being able to look at this stuff with an educated eye, I feel like is so important because, um, I've now kind of busted one of my own myths that I had heard, where it doesn't necessarily need to have like the sap, like the phloem or the xylem transfer, but it could just be like contact transfer, which it's really good to hear that that's not necessarily an easy way for that to occur, if at all possible. So keeping, yeah, plants elevated. I love that idea, especially for drain tables where in facilities there's a lot of times where I've seen, based on the construction of those drain tables, there may be a dip in them where it does build up a little water, but it's not too much to where you're creating like hypoxic environments within the root zone. You're just, giving them a little bit extra water compared to all the other plants that are on that table. And they're still using it up, but it is then at that point transferring between three or four plants or something that are in that dip in the table.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I will say one of the biggest, I think, details that a lot of growers miss is the rooting gel. When people are cloning, a lot of times they'll dip that clone. They're super careful about everything, and then they'll cut clones, and everybody gets dipped in the same shot glass, like 100 plants, same shot glass. But that is a gaping wound, a clone. You dip it in that shot glass, and it becomes like a little hoplite and viroid inoculum, and you're basically inoculating every single clone as you go through your process.
sure,
So be really careful, like thinking like that, like what am I sharing between these plants? And is there, either something that comes in contact with the roots or like clonal gel that I'm sharing. And even though I'm really careful, I'm infecting all of these clones by using the same gel for each clone.
sure.
Uh, yeah. And growing media is the same issue. We had one grower submit their growing media that they were reusing, the cocoa, and it tested positive. So I would recommend not reusing it. If you do choose to reuse it, you should sterilize it. Again, 10% bleach. I'd probably give it a good 10-minute soak just to kill off anything else that might be in there, and then rinse it really well. But yeah, reusing stuff between plants, you got to think about that. Pots, tools, growing media, everything can
Yeah,
transfer
or
it.
composting. Some people compost. Oh, this plant doesn't look healthy. I'm gonna compost it. But that's like the worst you could do.
Yeah.
Mm,
And then reusing it on the healthy ones. That's, yeah.
sure. Oh, that's a great point. I've heard in like living soil bed systems that's also one of the kind of the death touches to those beds is if you have hoplate and viroid, because typically you're leaving some level of root mass behind when you're um, transplanting with new plants for another cycle. Um, are there any ways to potentially kill off the viroid in living soil beds or other um, substrates that are reused? Because I know that sometimes that can be a significant investment for even a home grower if they're doing like a small 4x4 or a 2x4 fabric bed and they buy all this soil to fill it or they spend all this time to create their own soil at home. Yeah, are there any ways that you can potentially remove the viroid from the soil, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation with lots of growers that have this really awesome living soil that they've had for years and they've worked on it and it's really wonderful and rich. But unfortunately, any treatment that's going to remove the viroid is going to destroy everything that you love about your living soil in the first place. So
What about leaving it untouched for like a year?
yeah, I mean, I don't, the studies on how long, I think it's 6 months. So maybe you can let it sit for a very long time. I'd be wary. I'd want to test it just to be sure before you reuse it. But I mean, honestly, the best way to protect your living soil is don't plant anything in there until you test it first. Like don't go backwards and be like, oh, I've planted something that's positive in my living soil and that this was so important. Like put it in quarantine, test it twice, and then put it in your living soil. And then you don't have to worry about it because it's not positive. So
Yeah.
For sure.
that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah, and you know, in my mind, I'm thinking even if you let it sit for a long time, if there's any root mass left, then there's still potential for the viroid to replicate, right? And so the 6 month mark is probably after the last replication occurs. And so if you have food for it basically in there for a couple years, then you're still looking at like a couple years plus 6 months at that point for it to potentially be okay. And maybe there's even a little pocket of other uh, biological material in there that it can latch onto and continue to proliferate. Um, are, are
I
are
mean,
there other
sorry,
are there other
go
no,
ahead. Sorry.
sorry, are there other biological tissues that it could latch onto to continue to replicate itself other than
Plant,
plant matter?
like psyllium.
So yeah, so it's not going to be able to replicate in dead tissue per se, because
Okay.
it requires a living cell and it has to go into the special place in the cell called the nucleus. So once the tissue is dead, it's not going to be replicating necessarily. Um, we have to remember though, it's not alive, like the way we think of like a fungus or something being alive. It's almost like a toxin. It's like inert. So if it's there, it just hangs out, waiting to be rehydrated and uptook by a living cell, and then it just does its thing again. So really, what you're fighting is how stable is this? How much viroid is in my living soil, and how long do I have to wait until it actually degrades? And the answers to all of those questions aren't known. The one thing that has been shown for a viroid similar to hoplite viroid called hop stunt viroid is that it can be taken up by fungal pathogens and replicated inside of those. So if there's like fusarium or maybe, I mean, we don't know all the pathogens or organisms this could happen. They could even be like, endophytes or other types of living things in the soil. They may take up the viroid and keep it replicating until you plant new things in there. So it's really one of those things like, your living soil makes your plant's really awesome and you've worked very difficult on it. But if there's something in there that is just going to make everything tank, then it's not worth keeping because, you have it because they make your plants successful, but keeping the soil at some point, if it's infected, works the opposite way.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, I guess it's like if if you invested all this time into it, typically a lot of people when they've had a living soil bed for a couple years, but that investment might not necessarily be worth the pains that you will then face from hoplite and viroids or fusarium or
yeah,
something along those lines. So that
absolutely.
it's kind of one of those tough answers that I feel like people do need to hear, that it might just not be worth it. No matter how much time you let it sit there, there's potentials and opportunities for it to be an issue in the future. Um, so that's good. It is, like I said, that's a tough one though. I could only imagine having a whole facility go down, 100 light room all in living soil beds. That would be devastating.
No, absolutely. It's one of those really hard things to mitigate, and fusarium is worse, to be honest. It in out in the field, the spores can last like 3 to 5 years. And if
Wow.
you're in like a more protected environment, they can last up to 10. So
Whoa.
it's just not something that you want to mess with. So
Wow. I did not know that they could last 10 years in an indoor environment. That
yeah.
is frightening.
It is. It's terrifying. And that's why, I mean, hoplite viroid is an insidious pathogen. It can sneak into your grow, it can spread everywhere, but fusarium is devastating. If it really takes hold, it can kill an entire room in like a week, and the plants are
Yeah,
just dead.
Dead.
And
they
then
like melt into the table.
Yeah.
exactly. And it gets in the water system, it gets in the growing media, and it can go airborne. And then you're just looking at, like a nuclear option. So you really want to test for that. You do not want that to be in your facility or your basement at all.
Awesome. Yeah, that's that. I mean, that's not awesome, but it's awesome for people to know that
Yes.
that is can be more devastating. It's kind of the unspoken viroid that a lot of people, or pathogen that people don't really talk about too much, because when it does happen, it is just kind of like, well, I guess game's over at this point. Um, we did touch briefly on tissue culture before, and how that can be an option to help either potentially remove viroids or other pathogens from a plant. Um, but are there any other points on tissue culture that you feel like people should be aware of?
Do you want to take that one?
Um, well, especially like remembering that it's not 100%, that it doesn't work like that, and um, it could be expensive uh, to do that if you have several genetics strains that you have to clean up. Um, but also it does work in other crops, I guess, protected like similar to in grown in greenhouses. They use it successfully there, and but I'm sure that it is attached to a testing protocol. So like the tissue culture has to be tested for sure to know that the the culturing of those cells was successful without
Right.
any pathogens.
For sure. I do like that there are a lot of practices within tissue culture that within aseptic technique that kind of allow for you to help mitigate the transfer of pathogens. Like even within, like let's say you have something in tissue culture that does carry a pathogen with it, you have a lot more fail safes and stops in place to help prevent the transfer of it to other tissue culture that you're working with at the time. And then if you can prove that you have no pathogen or viroid in that plant tissue, then you can proliferate it from that small amount of plant matter into a much larger population to then help um, provide that genetic cultivar to other people in a very safe way, as long as it's, not entering a facility that already has a bunch of these problems and isn't going through some sort of quarantine phase. I think that tissue culture has a lot of potential, at least, especially within pathogen prevention and
Sure.
remediation. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, guys, and I feel like we've gotten a lot of information out there to people that they can kind of make actionable within their own gardens, which is very important to me. But I do like to kind of wrap these up as a cannabis podcast with a little bit more cannabis focused questions. So, quick question: do either of you currently use cannabis?
I tend to be more the edible type, but
For sure. Oh, well, I mean, edibles are still, a form of cannabis, I feel like, but I as someone who is also a user of cannabis, I feel like there's still a lot of stigma within the professional world of people using cannabis and incorporating it into their professional lives successfully. But Alfonso, like even with what you said earlier, it was almost cannabis that allowed you to develop all these different
Yeah,
skills because you were able to finally sit down and open a
yeah.
book and
There's
have
this
the attention span.
the stigma that society has created that if you smoke cannabis, you must be lazy or unproductive or unsuccessful. But I think that's a misunderstanding, and that's not true. It's just
Yep.
probably something that came out in the dark ages to, you know, bring down cannabis and all these manipulations that the government have done, or you know,
Yeah, I
influence.
agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I think it's so important to show that professionals, of your caliber, both of you being doctors, are pro cannabis. That's something that I feel like it opens up the door to more people who want to enter the different STEM fields, but might think that their passion for cannabis or um, other illicits like magic mushrooms, for example, and how many potential benefits there are to the different alkaloid components within mushrooms. Um, and then with cannabis, people think that that's their barrier to entry, that that's what they want to study, or that they want to make sure that that's continuing to be incorporated in their life, whether it be through a medical application or a recreational application. I mean, no one tests you if you drank alcohol the night before when you come into work the next day,
Yeah,
but that can be devastating for a heavy workload. You're going to come in and be more fuzzy and hazy and with less ability to do things than if you
yeah.
smoked a nice joint the night before.
Yeah, but I would like to add that cannabis research is in infancy, like it's just starting, and if smoking cannabis does not give you this effect, that it doesn't make you like productive, or it takes you the other way, maybe cannabis is not for you. There's different diseases out there that are coming out that are potentially death threatening that people are not aware, and it's just depending on your genetics. Not everybody is get affected by it, because as we all know, we are our cells are covering these receptors for cannabinoids, and it might be that your genetic makeup is not conducive to that, and you should
Sure.
be aware of that too.
Sure. I mean, there's even things like the cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, where that can be devastating to someone's entire life.
Sure.
And it is all, as far as we know, up to this point, cannabis induced and related. So I absolutely agree. I mean, just like with anything else in life, some people have a tolerance for it and some people don't, and some people can be functioning alcoholics and
Yeah.
do amazing work while completely, uh, you know, at the bottom of the barrel. Um, and so it is very much independent or subjective
Yeah.
in a sense where you need to make sure that you can handle it.
yeah.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Be careful and be smart. I'm saying to the people that want to use cannabis and wanna follow what I'm saying. It is like what my life experience was like that, but I do have friends that is the opposite, and
Sure.
yeah, and you have to learn to listen to your body and what is it telling you.
Sure. And because cannabis is also, it's not an aspirin, and it's not like a typical pharmaceutical where there's one component that's the active ingredient that's going to have a very universal response across most humans. Where cannabis, it has different terpene profiles, different cannabinoid profiles, other volatile organic compounds, and all of those kind of play together
Yes,
and can cause vastly different responses. It's sort of why so many people say, they love cannabis because variety is the spice of life, and they can have a huge variety of different experiences, all from technically the same plant, just different genetic expressions within that plant. Um, so yeah, I think that that's a very good point to bring up, that it's not a universal. We shouldn't put it in a good bad dichotomy.
correct.
It is very much subjective, and everyone can have a unique experience using cannabis. Um, so just a couple more questions for you guys, but and take this one in whichever way you want. Alfonso, you having grown cannabis, and Tassa, you having researched plenty of cannabis. But is there a favorite cultivar that either of you have encountered, either through research, where maybe it is just, it never catches hoplate and viroid, or it never has an issue if it does have it, or maybe through the growth characteristics of how it grows, if there's something that you find extremely uh, favorable for your own desires.
Yeah, I prefer the old school, what the people call the old school strains.
The OG strains.
Yeah, like the Northern Lights, Number Five, or AK-47. Those are my favorite. But recently, not that long ago, I brought some seeds from back home. Some land races that grow in the mountains of Peru, and I actually love it. It is kind of similar to having a glass of wine. It's not like very potent, like in the THC kind of, probably 1-to-1 THC CBD, probably one of those things. Very mellow and very active. You want to do things. You you want to get the next thing done, the next thing done, and yeah, I really like land races strains. It's just the flowering time is like 95 days or something like
Oh
that.
my God,
But it's
that's
ridiculous.
crazy.
Yeah, but I love that. Like I'm not very. I don't like the strains that are high in THC or. No. I prefer the other way. Probably I'm just getting older, so.
No, I think that it has a lot of benefit for people, especially when you do find like a true one-to-one
Yeah,
THC CBD. Those tend to work really well for people that have like high anxiety, or
yeah.
their attention span might need to be, tweaked in one way or the other. I feel like those always tend to work fairly well for people. But you can never really find a 95-day cultivar on the commercial market, because
It will be.
you can't charge more for something that you grow longer, right?
Yeah.
That's true.
And so it then becomes that much more expensive to create that final product. So I always say for home growers, they should absolutely try growing out something that's like an equatorial strain, because they will never experience that to its fullest potential unless they grow it themselves. Um, and so Tassa, uh,
Yeah. So
your favorite cultivar.
yeah. To smoke, I don't have as many cultivars in my pocket as Alfonso here. I actually don't know anyone that has as many cultivars in this pocket as him. But I tend to favor the ones grown outside. I haven't read any of that literature, and I don't understand like why that is, or what the scientific basis of it is, but um, they tend to make me less anxious. And I also prefer the ones where there's a little bit less THC. I and then I take gummies sometimes, if like my brain is spinning at night and I can't sleep. And they've actually been like game changing for me because, if you take a Benadryl or something, the next day it's like somebody hit you in the head with a 2x4 for
Oh, I
like the
can't
first
do it.
like
Yeah.
6 hours. But you can take a gummy and the next day you just fall asleep great. And the next day you wake up and you're just feeling good and you're ready for the day. And, to me, it's phenomenal that there's a stigma around that because it's just so much more gentle and effective than all the stuff that you could get at the doctors. If you're like, oh, I can't fall asleep, they're like, here's an Ambien, and you're just,
Yeah.
I can't remember what I did last night. Um, but yeah, and then from the science side, I don't remember all of the strains, but I do remember one specific one called Motorhead that we had an incredibly difficult time infecting with hoplate and viroid. It built the level super low. I think we inoculated 15 clones, and something like 2 of them had a very low, almost undetectable level, and it took like
Wow.
entire flowering time frame in order for it to build up enough viroid, for it to be like a reasonable level. So from the science side, like that one was a pretty good one when it comes to resistance. Tolerance, Illuminati tended to be it got infected like that and built up a super high load, but it did not show any symptoms.
Wow.
That would be your Trojan horse strain to
Sure.
watch out for. Now, I will qualify that with that was that specific Motorhead and that specific Illuminati. And
Sure.
as we all know, you could go and buy those strains and they may behave completely differently because um, they have the same name, but genetically they're not, the same plant. And so do be
For
careful.
sure. Yeah, there's a lot of, I feel like, confusion through the way that seeds are marketed within the cannabis industry. And so usually when I refer to like a single plant, I'll refer to it as a cultivar, like with normal agriculture. And then a seed would be like a genetics, right? Or a cross or
Yeah.
a strain, perhaps, if you want to go down that path. But yeah, I feel like that's that's good information to have. People, it the fact that there are the abilities for plants to completely almost like ignore the fact that the viroid's even present and uptakeable by the plant. It'll be nope, I don't really care to have that whatever mechanism of action it is that's causing it to not be uptook. That's just very special in and of itself. And then also the fact that you can have a ridiculously high threshold of or viroid presence within the tissue, and that it just doesn't even affect the flowering time or the yield or the final product. That's amazing.
Yeah,
It's
no,
a very
it's very cool, and it's a place of super interesting research because if you could figure out the gene or genes that keep the viroid that are involved in transmitting it around the plant, like the transport or the replication, then maybe you can breed that in to the strains that you like and just kind of create a bunch of resistant things. So it's
sure.
definitely something that, if I had like clones of myself, I would be doing those experiments all the time.
For sure. All right, and then last question for both of you. What is your most memorable cannabis related experience? Whether it be something in the lab or even a personal use experience or otherwise.
Uh,
That's a, that's a hard question.
It's I figured it would be kind of one of the harder questions that I asked.
like maybe you can start. I can think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I honestly like from the lab standpoint, the most memorable one was after, 2 months of frustration being like, wow, I've designed hundreds of PCRs. Like, what's wrong with me? Realizing that the plants we have at home are actually positive, and that's why we can't get the test to work, and that's why the weed sucked for so many years was pretty pretty memorable from a science standpoint, and kind of cool in a sense because you're like, oh my God, how many people are struggling with the same problem we are? And, we're scientists. We had no idea that this was even there. And then from a personal standpoint, I guess I'm probably one of those people that Alfonso cautions about when it comes to smoking, because I definitely can't have a big joint and go to the lab. That I would, maybe I'd have fun, but nothing smart would come out of me at all. And there's definitely strains that I have to be careful with because I get anxious or freak out, or so those are memories. Maybe they're not good ones per se, but I, did the discovery of edibles and being able to fall asleep at night when I'm feeling anxious, and just having that, get like the medicinal, like I don't get high or anything. I just fall asleep, and then the next day is pleasant for me. Like, that's been a huge thing for me in my life. And I'm glad to be alive at a time when I could use that legally to feel better. So
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
for me, I don't have a specific thing that I could remember. But I do like the social aspect of cannabis, that it doesn't matter if you talk English or whatever language or whatever background or race or religion you are. You just smoking a joint together. You're like, it's kind of like feels connected, and
Sure.
you share things, and I don't know, it's something like brings makes you humble, and listening and understanding other opinions. And I think it's the social aspect for me is something big.
For sure. Yeah, sharing a joint or something is a great equalizer
Right?
across all different barriers that you might face otherwise, social or economic
Yeah.
or status based. If you light up a nice joint and people smell it, and you
You
just
say,
want
hey,
to hang out and smoke, it's easy.
and then you like
Yeah,
start talking, and you get to know this person and where they coming from, their experiences, and it is great. It is equality for
it's
sure.
awesome.
for everyone.
Oh, I love it. Well, again, guys, this has been a wonderful conversation. Tassa, Alfonso, I really appreciate your time. I know that both are probably extremely busy with how many different grows and operations you must be serving at this point. But yeah, this has been great, and this podcast is designed to help people learn new processes or help perfect other processes that they have. And I feel like we've provided a lot of information today that will allow them to take a look at some of the cultural practices of their grow operation and potentially prevent massive issues from arising in the future, as well as maybe take that first step and get some of their plants tested that they haven't been doing yet and kind of been putting off because of financial or stubbornness or otherwise. So yeah, this has been great, and I really appreciate your time.
Of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us on. It
Yeah.
was a
Thanks
lot of
very
fun.
much, Nick.
Awesome.
Always a
All
pleasure
right.
to share.
Yeah.
All right, well, getting this information out there, like I like to say, is how we grow the community, and that's the way we grow. So, again, thank you guys.
Yep.
Thank you,
Thank
Nick.
you. All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.